Everyone remembers Need for Speed, Gran Turismo, or F1, but what about the racing gems that slipped under the radar? Let's hit the gas on some underrated racing games from the 2000s that you might have missed. Every game you see in this video here today released between the years of 2000 to 2010. And to kick off this video, I'd like to start with a game that's very close to my heart, and that is Hot Wheels World Race. Hot Wheels World Race is a fairly standard racer developed by Climax Brighton and published by THQ. It released on PS2, GameCube and Windows, as well as having a Game Boy Advance port, and released in late 2003. The developer Climax Brighton would later go on to be bought out by Disney and turned into Black Rock Studio, who brought you Pure and Split Second Velocity. Anyway, World Race is based on the Hot Wheels film called Hot Wheels World Race. It was also divided into 5 episodes on Cartoon Network titled Hot Wheels Highway 35 World Race, and was part of the Hot Wheels 35th anniversary. The game is a standard track racer with a nice adrenaline boost of Hot Wheels spirit. You could do different tricks in the air to gain boost, and then you could also collect gold rings which also increased your boost. Whilst the game doesn't do masses to stand out from other racers at the time, it does have that Hot Wheels charm. Very cool tracks, very cool stunts, big jumps, high speed, and futuristic environments. The game also has a pretty decent car lineup, including icons such as Twin Mill and Roger Dodger, and even cooler cars like Diora 2 and 24/7. Every version of the game except the Game Boy Advance port, of course, featured split-screen multiplayer, and that's where I spent a lot of time with this game as a kid, playing split-screen with my sister. The game runs nicely, it looks pretty nice, and overall I'd say it's a pretty decent game, even if it doesn't do too much to stand out. If you're a Hot Wheels fan, I would definitely recommend playing this game. Now, the PS2 version of this game would review very middling review scores, with it currently holding a 55 out of 100 on Metacritic, which I personally think is way too low, as there are much worse racing games that we've covered here on this channel with higher review scores than this. However, the user score is much more positive with a 7.5 out of 10, moving it up into the generally favourable bracket. The game would go on to sell a decent amount of copies on the PS2 as well, with over 400,000 copies sold, and if we add in the GameCube and Game Boy Advance port sales, then that would take it over a nice 600,000. These sale figures, as well as any other sales figures quoted in the video, are from VG charts. Anyway, let's move away from toy cars racing to real cars racing for our next title. Now, before we go any further, if you're a fan of 2000s racing games or 2000s games in general, then why not hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. And whilst you're at it, if you want to be the first to hear about upcoming videos, or you just want to come and chat about video games, then join my Discord server using the link in the description below. Anyway, that is enough plugging the channel, let's get back to these underrated racing games. And for our next game we've got a pretty heavy hitter, so let me introduce to you Project Gotham Racing 3. So the Project Gotham Racing series wasn't a series that I would deem as underrated at the time, but has certainly fallen into obscurity as the years have gone on. The Project Gotham Racing series was originally Microsoft's flagship racer before Forza stepped in, and Project Gotham Racing 3 was no different. It released in 2005 and served as a launch title for the fantastic Xbox 360. The game was developed by Bizarre Creations, who were the same team behind the previous 2 entries in the series, as well as the game that is the spiritual predecessor to Project Gotham Racing, Metropolis Street Racer. Visually, the game looks absolutely fantastic, and really showed off what the Xbox 360 was capable of in terms of visuals and audio. It also featured 80 cars and several real-world locations, including Las Vegas, London, and Tokyo. PGR3 had a bigger emphasis on supercars and special models as compared to the previous 2 entries in the series. Everything about this game at the time just felt truly next-gen, visually, audibly, and in terms of its handling. Everything just felt really good, and this would reflect in the game's review scores, where it currently holds an 88 out of 100 on Metacritic, as well as a slightly less positive but still good user score of 7.8 out of 10. And whilst the game would definitely not be a bestseller for the console, it still went on to sell 600,000 copies, which is pretty good going. If you've never played a Project Gotham Racing game, I would highly recommend any of them, but especially 3 or 4. They are just absolutely fantastic. With the 25th anniversary of the Xbox brand next year, it would be nice to see some kind of nod to Project Gotham Racing, but I doubt we'll see anything. Now let's stick with the Xbox for just a little bit longer as we move on to Wreckless, the Yakuza missions. This game is also known as Double Steel in Japan, but either way, this game released in February of 2002 as a launch title for the original Xbox in Japan. The console had been out in the rest of the world for a bit longer, but in Japan specifically, this was a launch title. Anyway, the game would also end up on the GameCube and PS2 later that same year, but we're not going to talk about those ones because they have some major performance issues. Anyway, the game was developed by Bakancha and was published by Activision outside of Japan, but published by Bakancha themselves within Japan. Interestingly enough, the game was developed on Traveler's Tales T-Total engine, which I thought was pretty cool. Anyway, this isn't really your traditional racer, it's a story-driven mission-based action game. The game sees you in Hong Kong trying to take down the Yakuza, and there are a couple of stories ongoing here, so I won't go too deeply into them. Missions vary from having to finding a set of bombs in a limited amount of time, taking photos for evidence, or having to destroy a group of Yakuza cars or defend something from them. The handling feels very tight, and they go for a more realistic vibe, as well as having a very, very impressive destruction engine. So much of the environment can be destroyed, it's fantastic. And it was a game that truly showed off what the original Xbox could do. Again, it's not the greatest game ever made. In fact, a lot of the missions do start to get quite repetitive quite fast, because it's the same few things with a new coat of paint over and over again. The game would review pretty well with a 74 out of 100 Metascore on Metacritic, although it doesn't actually have a user score. As I mentioned, the game would later get ported to PS2 and GameCube, where they would suffer some major performance issues, but they did have more content, but those versions would review at 60 and 58 respectively. The original Xbox version would go on to sell just shy of 600,000 copies, which is pretty respectable, although the game did a horrible job at pushing the Xbox in Japan as no one was buying it. Anyway, for our next entry we are heading off-road. So our next game is Shox, also known as Shox Rally Reinvented, which was an arcade rally racing game developed by EA UK, also known as EA Brightlight, and was published by EA and released in 2002 for the PlayStation 2. That's a lot of twos. Shox is a vibrant, fast-paced and unapologetically arcade experience, featuring generic rallying locations, but also including real licensed cars, such as from Lancia and Ford. The unique twist of Shox was areas called Shox Zones, and each course would have a few different Shox Zones for you to play through and get ranked on between bronze, silver and gold. The time in which it takes you to cross through these zones is what determines what ranking you get at the end, as well as a cash-based reward based on that rank. The 3 different kinds of environments you will discover are Arid, which is a desert kind of vibe, Jungle, which speaks for itself, and Ice, which again speaks for itself. The game also has a damage system where you will have to pay to get your cars repaired, with the money you earn from winning races and passing through Shox Zones. You can also use this money to buy new cars, and there are 24 different cars in the game, all of which featuring some pretty decent visual damage and show dirt from the tracks. The sheer atmosphere and energy that this game gives off alone makes it worth checking out, and I'm ashamed to say that making this video was the first time I'd actually played the game at all. In terms of review scores, Shox would go on to receive a 78 out of 100 Metascore, which is pretty good going. The user score is actually quite a bit lower, with a 6 out of 10, moving it down to the average zone. Unfortunately, the game would not be a big seller for EA, with the game only just selling 90,000 copies. If anybody watching has played this game before, or even owns it now, let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts on the game are. Anyway, let's move on to our final entry in this video, and we're going to go for a more stylistic approach with this one. So yes, our final entry is a game called Auto Modellista. I'm not quite sure if that's the correct pronunciation, so for the sake of argument we're calling this AM. Anyway, AM is a stylistic racing game developed and published by Capcom, initially releasing on the PS2 across late 2002 to early 2003, eventually getting ported to the GameCube in late 2003 and the Xbox in early 2004. The game uses a gorgeous cel-shaded art style which, even now over 20 years later, still looks absolutely fantastic. But the game itself, whilst presenting itself in a cartoony way, goes for a more realistic style of handling with a very in-depth customization system. Both visual and performance upgrades can be put on each car, with various tweaks to the performance that you can provide. The game also featured some real-world locations, but in a cel-shaded art style such as the Suzuka circuit, which I just think is such a cool concept, just taking these real-world locations and real-world cars and making them look like they're coming straight out of a comic book. I personally find it a bit odd that no other game has attempted this since, because AM has somewhat of a cult following. Anyway, the game featured a fairly extensive single-player mode, as well as an online multiplayer mode, although this was not present on the GameCube or the European PS2 versions. Every version of AM would go on to have middling reviews, especially the Xbox version, which sits at 52 out of 100, but the PS2 version sits at 66 and the GameCube at 62. Pretty much universally, the visuals were praised by every critic, but most of them also had an issue with the game's handling. The PS2 version would go on to sell moderately well with just shy of 400,000 copies sold, but unfortunately the Xbox and GameCube versions would not fare anywhere near as well, with the GameCube version estimating to have only sold about 30,000 copies, and the original Xbox version selling even less at 10,000, which really is not good. Anyway, that takes us to the end of our look at some underrated 2000s racing games. Have you guys played any of these games? If you have, let me know in the comments down below. And if there's any 2000s racing games you think I've missed off for this video, let me know in the comments down below, so maybe we can do a sequel. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap that bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.